All right, Dr. Urban is a researcher from Penn State who'll be giving an overview of the progression of the spotted lanternfly infestation, which I think we all knew began in Pennsylvania. So take it away, Julie. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Scott. Wonderful to get to kick off this exciting meeting. And so, as Scott indicated, I'm a faculty member at Penn State, and I happen to specialize in plant hoppers. And so I was one of the scientists who was brought in 2014, just after lanternfly was detected in Pennsylvania. And so I have seen how this has progressed and how my involvement has increased with it. I'm currently leading a large regional USDA NIFA funded specialty crops grant. And I'll show our website for that is stopslf.org. And so that's where I think these recordings will be posted. And so I'm here to start you off in Lanternfly 101 with the story of lanternfly in Pennsylvania. It's kind of a grand set of objectives, what we thought we knew at the beginning, what we've learned since, and what to expect in the next 3 years. So I'm going to try to cover a bit of our past as it informs our present situation and future situation and expectations for lanternfly. So here we are, have a spotted lanternfly, and I presume with so many people in the audience, you really vary in your familiarity, but I'm just starting from square one. The most important thing to know about spotted lanternfly, it's a sap-feeding insect. Its mouth parts are fused into a straw-like beak, and there you can see this is a nice fat female, and that's her beak laying down the length of her abdomen. And so here we'll see that's her mouth parts right there. She's got them inserted into a plant. And inside that exterior exoskeleton sheath are two tiny hair-like stylets. They're just a little bit thinner than a human hair. And those get inserted into the plant tissue. And that's what lanternfly uses to salivate and to probe and puncture plant tissues. And so lanternfly is a very, very, very generalist feeder. It'll feed on essentially anything. Its food preference is relative to what's around, but what it won't feed on are conifers. And so if we start this story of chapter 1, Lanternfly Past, in putting together this talk, I went through some of my photos. And actually, just to let you know, like when spotted lanternfly was first detected in Pennsylvania, I was working at the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences in Raleigh. And I had just so happened to have studied the plant hopper lineage. There's 14,000 described species in 21 families. Lanternflies or Fulgoridae are one family. I happen to specialize on those in my dissertation and worked on the genetics of samples from around the world to determine, kind of esoteric research, but with a practical bent about how they've evolved with microbes that essentially provision them with food from the inside out. And so we knew about spotted lanternfly because it was an invasive in South Korea starting in 2004. So folks were kind of on the lookout. And so I got a call. They detected it September 22nd, 2014. And I had samples sent to me that were collected September 26th. And so my colleagues who detected it, who were working at Pennsylvania Department of Agriculture at the time, I happened to know them from grad school. They knew I did genetics work. And so I was kind of brought in on the team. And so at that time, we had a number of meetings, right away, USDA and PDA put out, got together this working group of scientists from around the country and some from overseas. And within 2 weeks, the quarantine was established and everyone was, off and running, starting their work on lanternfly. And so one of the things that group did is they brought the scientists up to visit the site where lanternfly was first detected in May of that following spring. And so this is at that site, and this is one of those egg masses that was laid that first year it was detected in a photo that I took, and it was very surreal to see what's otherwise a tropical group of insects in Pennsylvania. And we actually saw the first hatchlings when we were there that day. And so spotted lanternfly, like Lycorma delicatula, is an unusual species even among lanternflies, in that it occurs in such temperate regions when this is mostly a tropical group. And so I'll never forget, this is a photo that the now retired Greg Hoover from Penn State took of really one of the first lanternfly hatchlings, observed in the US. And so how did it get here? Okay, lanternflies will lay their eggs on anything. They're very, very unusual among sap-feeding insects, because typically, a sap-feeding insect needs to be close to its host plant. And so when the hatchlings hatch out, as you could see in the previous picture, the early instars, or the early stages, don't have wings. It's not until they go through a series of molts where lanternfly and typically any other hemipteran insect, before they develop wings and can really move around. And so it's unusual, if you are laying your eggs and your offspring clearly need to feed, typically hemipterans will lay their eggs where their offspring can feed. And lanternfly apparently didn't read that literature, because it'll lay its eggs on essentially anything. And so this isn't an artifact of this particular species being in an invaded range where it might be very crowded in some dense sites. This is a feature that I've seen in the tropics, that other species engage in. When I was in Malaysia, lanternflies will lay their egg masses on the research station where I stayed, for example, or on rocks. And so this is kind of one cue or one indicator as to how incredibly mobile these insects are, even as nymphs when they can't fly. And so this is, this ability to lay your eggs on anything, including stone or human-made objects, is one of the things that makes lanternfly such an incredibly good hitchhiker. From where the first detections were made, it looks like lanternfly hitchhiked from Asia to Pennsylvania on a shipment of landscaping goods, of landscaping rocks, either on the pallet or on the rocks themselves. And so you can see on anything, even on trees, it's very hard to see lanternfly eggs, but this is a good indicator of what they look like. Unlike praying mantis eggs or other things, these are laid in very, very linear rows with the eggs end to end. They change in their appearance over time. A protinaceous covering is laid over them, but sometimes that wears off. Sometimes it's laid sloppily. And so you can see they're very hard to see. And so it's not surprising that these were evaded detection. And so, what did we learn? We know from the Korean literature that lanternfly will feed on a huge variety of plants. Back at that time, it was there were records made that lanternfly fed on over 70 different host plants, and since then, that number's increased as folks have learned more about lanternfly to over 100. But of the many things that it feeds on, another contributor to it being really a challenge and a good invader is that one of its highly preferred host plants is tree of heaven, or Ailanthus altissima. And so here, to let you kind of focus in on that, tree of heaven is an introduced invasive, and it is really, it's a weedy invasive species in its own right. And here you see, this is a tree of heaven tree that had been cut down, and that doesn't stop the lanternflies from feeding upon it. We know that in order to actually remove these trees, you need to subsequently treat them with herbicide and kill the tissue while it's metabolizing, because if you just leave it like this, it'll continue to sprout and it will grow suckers underground. And you can see these little shoots growing out of it, mean that this trunk is still alive, and lanternfly is happily feeding on what we call little tree of heaven candy canes. And so trying to get rid of its preferred host in and of itself is hugely problematic. But tree of heaven tends to grow in very disturbed habitats along rail lines and highways. And so essentially it has paved the way for lanternfly to spread as it feeds upon it. And so back in 2014, lanternfly was first detected here just in 6 townships in Berks County in eastern Pennsylvania. So if you go and look at this little inset that shows you this area colored in green as this black area kind of around Philadelphia. And so Pennsylvania Department of Agriculture did extensive surveys that I'll show you in a second, and basically found where they detected lanternfly. They put a quarantine around those 6 townships. Each subsequent year, they continued to do their surveys. And so in 2015, it was found in a few more areas. And so the lanternfly quarantine was expanded to additional townships that jumped into 2 additional counties. In 2016, it expanded a little bit further, but just in 5 counties. And so, or 6 counties actually. And so then at this point, if you know anything about the township names, they kind of all sound like each other, and it's hard to know what's what. So they moved to calling whole counties under quarantine in 2017. And that's why it's not necessarily that lanternfly was found throughout all of these counties colored in green, but that's when the quarantine expanded to include full counties at a time. And so in 2016, I told you I was working in North Carolina in 2014. In 2016, I had the opportunity to come to Penn State. And so I was still moving back and forth myself in 2016. And so 2017 was really the first year I was here. I had a doctoral student who I kind of inherited. She had been doing work on lanternfly in the previous year. But when we went out and did our field work in 2017, we really got worried. We saw some things that suggested very strongly to us, and that things were changing. Okay, so here, this is that detection map that I want to mention. When PDA, or when I say PDA, I mean Pennsylvania Department of Agriculture, when they were doing their surveys, you can see they were really doing a lot of work. And so each dot on this map is a place where they conducted their survey. If they found spotted lanternfly there, it's given a red circle. If they searched there and didn't find any lanternfly, it was green. And so you look, and although it had jumped into these other counties in 2017, it wasn't, it was basically very, very heavily concentrated still in that core region in Berks. And you can see in terms of where they looked at, around Philadelphia, because if it gets to a port, that's potentially problematic. They look throughout the state, but you'll also notice, if you can see my cursor, high concern they expressed for whether or not lanternfly is in this grape growing region that's really important for juice grape production around Erie. And so, as I said, in 2017, though, things looked a little bit different. And this is a vineyard in the Berks area, very close to that original site of the first detection. And my student was planning some insecticide trials to test the efficacy of lanternfly, to test against lanternfly in vineyards. And so we know from the literature in South Korea that lanternfly did economic damage to grapes. And we did observe lanternfly feeding on grapes. And so in March of that year, we went out riding around with the grower to figure out where we wanted to put our plots. And what we saw were, dozens of lanternfly egg masses laid on posts in this vineyard. And so you can't really tell, it was pouring down rain. And even from inside the truck, we saw post after post that, each was just slackered with these egg masses. And so we thought, oh nuts, this is getting bad. And we saw higher densities than throughout the season. We saw very high densities of fourth, for example. But then it was in late summer, actually in September that year, when my student Erica took this video in that same vineyard. And so you can see lanternfly feeding in really high densities. You can see they're squirting out their excrement. And so this is, it's their excrement, but we call it honeydew. And that's because they're feeding on sugary plant sap. And so their excrement is very sugary. And we'll see that that's a substrate for sooty mold that likes to feed on that. But basically you see lanternfly, these are, just a little over an inch long. And if they're squirting out that much honeydew, they're feeding that heavily. So we saw these incredible densities that were very alarming. You can see the honeydew buildup on the leaves. But we saw something else at this particular grower's field that we hadn't seen before. And so he had 40 acres of grapes, but he also had an apple orchard. And up until that point, the 2 prior years when Erica was doing her study in this particular site, we not only did we not see the high densities, but we also never saw them on the apples. And then she called me and I went out and saw this, and we saw them coming into the apples, feeding on them. You could, up close, we could see their mouth parts were inserted, and they were feeding very heavily on apple. And so, hi little guy, that's the insult to the injury when they crawl over your camera. And so this is when folks got very concerned. USDA obviously had been working on this, but this is when then there was an emergency meeting of our technical working group. This is when the state of Pennsylvania, Senate and House had joint hearings on lanternfly, because we were getting really the first reports of damage. And we were very, very, very concerned. And so we know that from the literature in South Korea, it was reported that lanternfly also damaged apples, other tree fruit, nuts, other things, forest trees. And we saw them then. This is on an ornamental in someone's yard. And so this was really when people got concerned about lanternfly. And so we're very worried about what is it going to do. And so the other thing that happened that year is lanternfly eggs were detected then in Winchester, Virginia, along a rail line near a truck transport station. And so lanternfly made a big jump. And so it was clear populations were larger and they were spreading. And so we also saw at that time, really the first recorded economic impacts. And so this was a study done by some folks at Penn State. Jay Harper is our agricultural economist. And they did surveys of just 5 vineyards that were in that area that reported any damage. And they reported losses, but also what they reported was increased cost in insecticide application. And so when lanternfly come into vineyards, they do so particularly in the late season. All of those videos that I just showed you were lanternfly moving in September into new areas. And so, and doing so in high numbers. And so this is right before the grapes are harvested. So growers are not able to apply compounds that can act very long. They have to maintain what's called a pre-harvest interval. And so they need to apply additional applications, but they have to do that somewhat frequently to try to keep these numbers down. So they reported over tripling the number of applications that they made from an average of 4.2 to 14. And then that also tripled the cost. And the darndest thing about it is that it still killed the vineyards. And so this is the vineyard where I showed you the egg masses where my student was working. All 40 acres were dead. And this was by May 2019. And so certainly there were other factors that likely contributed to this as well. But it's one thing to say they damage grapes, and it's really a different thing to see it. And so we did see that damage in other areas. This is a vineyard outside of Allentown, not complete loss, but certainly significant damage. And so really 2019, we saw, yes, lanternfly is having these impacts. And so at that time, Jason Harper also led a study that looked at, did economic impact studies based on market value of various commodities. And so you might have seen this study cited. They talked about it in the Wall Street Journal, but basically the expected direct economic impact from direct feeding from lanternfly in agriculture was estimated to be over $42 million a year statewide, with the hardest hit sectors expected to be fruit growers, especially grape, but also including, apple and tree fruit and nuts, but also nursery operators and Christmas tree growers. Worst case scenario, they gave a range of values. You can check out the paper, but basically they said, okay, worst case scenario, that could be more than truly double, depending on how bad this gets. In terms of forest products, and lanternfly feeding on forest trees, because again, we saw that being reported in South Korea, that lower end estimate was over 150 million statewide per year, almost over 200 million, potentially worst case scenario statewide. And then when they added to it direct and indirect impacts in Pennsylvania, so looking at reduced consumer spending, for example, as a result of lanternfly and whatnot, then that they estimated a loss of almost 90 million a year and 927 jobs, but in a worst case scenario, being over 550 million and almost 5,000 jobs lost statewide per year. And so this might be, if you all are in, many of you are in other states, and you might, be worried about lanternfly, like, oh my gosh, what if this happens in my state? Okay. And so this was what we expected, right? These predictions are based on what we saw from the South Korean literature, but these predictions are all based on this presumption that SLF feeding will directly damage fruit and forest trees through feeding. And so the question is, okay, again, those based on that literature from South Korea, where they didn't really quantify those impacts. They just kind of mentioned them in their literature. And so, okay, kind of the question that takes us from past now to present is this what we have observed? Have we seen lanternfly directly damaging fruit and forest trees through feeding? So that takes us to lanternfly, chapter 2, lanternfly present. And so here, this is as close as I can get to when I think of a lanternfly present. This is what I think of. My colleagues who know me on this call know that I study reproductive development in spotted lanternfly. And so I do a lot of dissections. And so, what is the chance that Julie is going to give a presentation for this long and not show something she pulled out from inside a lanternfly? The chances of that are none. Okay, I'm going to show you something from inside a lanternfly. And so basically, this is a photo that I took of a spermatophore. And this is what the male passes to the female when they mate. And so I thought I would share with you the closest thing to a lanternfly present that I know about. Okay, so where are we at? And so this is the map from when I gave this talk last year. You can see that, compared to those earlier maps I showed, this is a great map that Brian Eschnauer puts together for us at New York State IPM. And so here we can see that lanternfly had really expanded from 2017 to 2021. You see these blue areas are areas where established lanternfly populations, are known to occur. And so you can see that those occurred in Pennsylvania and really in all contiguous states at that time. And the purple, so up here in New York, and those purple dots are places where lanternfly was detected. So maybe being brought in on some nursery stock or whatnot. But surveys found none were established. And so you can see those purple spots down here into North Carolina, on the coast, in many different areas, showing how good of a hitchhiker lanternfly is, but not established at that point, at that time. And there also were detections in California, Oregon, and Washington. Okay, so how have things changed in a year? Fading in, okay, the map got bigger. All right, and so what we can see now is we have these counties down here in Virginia, so it made a bit of a jump. We see an established population over here in Indiana. We see 2 counties in Ohio, so kind of nearing that grape production belt. And if I just go back to the previous slide, okay, look at Massachusetts and Long Island in that area. Okay, you can see that what's happened in last year, that was last year, and now this year, this thing's really spread into urban areas. It's in all 5 boroughs in New York City. And so that's certainly a problem. It's there in Massachusetts as well. And so it's getting close to these urban centers. And so what about those impacts? Is it damaging all of those different crops? And so it's kind of good news. To date, lanternfly only kills grapes and tree of heaven, and that hurts to say only grapes, because it is very damaging to grapes. And so this is one of the vineyards where we've worked, and what you can see here is what's going on. Lanternfly nymphs are there throughout the season. They'll feed on grapes their whole life cycle, but the sprays that are applied for other pests at the time are enough to knock them down. And what happens, and why vineyards get hit so badly, is that during this late season, we think it's associated with their mating, but also but lanternfly move, and they move into new areas in higher numbers. And that's also likely because they've been feeding on certain trees, perhaps tree of heaven, or other trees. And when they build up at high densities, they likely are driving the resources of those trees down or depleting them, and they need to move on to find additional food sources, because they really, really need to fatten up heavily to become reproductively mature. And so if you're around for the Spotted Lanternfly Summit, that's a lot of what I'll be talking about when I talk about my research. But basically, just to give you a sense of the numbers, if you haven't seen this before, these look like berries or like grapes on the ground, and they're not. Those are dead lanternfly. So lanternfly will just swarm in from these surrounding areas, feed on the grapevines. Insecticides are very effective at knocking them down, and it looks like they've mulched with lanternfly. But the thing is, more will keep coming in and keep hammering these grapes and depleting them of their resources. And so one of the presentations that you'll see on the first research day will be some work that's being led by one of our viticulturists, Michaela Centenari, looking at how lanternfly feeding impacts different aspects of grape plant physiology, not just at the time they're feeding, but also throughout the year. And so in terms of what can this direct feeding, what does this direct feeding do? What plants does it kill? Yes, it can kill grape, and yes, it can kill tree of heaven. We have record of that. But the good news is that doesn't seem to be a problem in apple or stone fruit orchards. Even with this super high number of lanternfly feeding on them, we have no reports of any damage. They'll come in for about 3 weeks and feed and then move on. And so this is the same thing. I showed you that picture of them feeding on an ornamental tree. They don't come in and kill those trees. And so Kelly Hoover and Tracy Lesky, these are other scientists you'll hear presenting, looking at their studies, trying to determine the effects of spotted lanternfly feeding on fruit and ornamental trees. How does it influence the physiology? It does have effects, but even with high numbers of lanternfly feeding in that late season, SLF is more of a stressor based on these studies. It does not directly kill those trees. Certainly if combined with another pathogen, if combined with drought, with other things, that could be damaging. But the good news is lanternfly, from the evidence we have right now, it's not going to come in and kill your orchard. It's not going to come in and kill your maples. And then in terms of the timber industry, especially because that's so important for the economy of Pennsylvania, it's not killing, ornamentals or forest trees, but even a little bit more than that, we have really no evidence that SLF penetrates into forests. We have folks at Penn State who tried to set up plots within forests. They found fourths on some black walnut in one case, Dr. Laura Leides in the College of Ag, and she set up a study. They surveyed, and they were ready to track the impacts of these fourths when they got to adults, feeding on these trees, and they bugged out, and they never saw lanternfly in that area again. And so it doesn't seem to penetrate forests. It typically feeds on trees in the edges or disturbed areas. And so we're really less concerned at this point that direct feeding is going to be a problem for forest trees. Where is it a problem? Okay, where are we seeing other economic impacts? Well, certainly in nurseries. And so here this is a nursery in Eastern Pennsylvania that we were working with. And what you can see back here is just a mess of tree of heaven. And the lanternfly will come in and feed. And so we have some reports of feeding damage to nursery stock. If you think about, not these particular conifers, but the other things growing at a nursery, there's all sorts of different varieties of maples and other trees and whatnot. And you can kind of consider that a salad bar for lanternfly. What is it like? Well, if it finds something it likes, it can damage that nursery stock. But the other issue here is that it gets into things. And so nurseries need to keep, we have the quarantine, and we also have, in terms of the reputation of your business, even dead lanternfly, you don't want them to get into your nursery stock when you ship it to another state, especially one that doesn't have lanternfly. And so you need to keep lanternfly out of those products. And so here they don't feed on conifers, but they certainly get in there. Okay. And so this requires additional time and resources for companies to change their management techniques. We're trying to help them, and with best management practices to suggest, loading shipments either early morning or later in the evening when you don't have these intense periods of lanternfly activity. But basically the problem they're dealing with is keeping them out of their stock. And that's the same thing with Christmas tree growers. They're not directly feeding on Christmas trees at all. And I'm used to seeing what I see, but I showed my talk to my husband, and he's like, you have to show that. And what those are lanternfly egg masses laid on this Christmas tree. And so you can see where detection is really a problem. And so again, this is kind of more indirect way is how Christmas tree growers get impacted by lanternfly. And then certainly, what about these other industries? Any organization that moves anything, including their own vehicles, through the quarantine zones, need to be in compliance with the quarantine. And I'm sure that's something that my colleagues will talk with you more about. So these economic impacts are associated with maintaining quarantine compliance. In terms of the timber industry, that means making sure that they're not moved on logs, especially egg masses. And then with tree fruit, making sure, again, no life stage can be on them, but that's certainly a problem when you're talking about harvest and lanternfly getting in and potentially laying their egg masses on fruit crates. So not great to have to deal with this, but better than, heavy feeding killing trees. And so part of maybe some of the things we'd like other regions to learn from our experience is that you learn things as you deal with lanternfly, and it means that you need to change the message. What I'm doing right now is changing the message. Yes, we thought it was gloom and doom, but now we have more data, and now we see these are the ways we need to work smarter against lanternfly and change and talk about the impacts we really are feeling. There's another one out there, though, that's a longer term impact that can't really say. And basically what you're looking at here is these are understory plants on the edge of a forested area, and they've been excreted upon by spotted lanternfly. So that honeydew is a substrate for sooty mold growth. And so what you can see, it almost looks like somebody tried to burn these leaves. That's sooty mold growth. And so we don't know what the long-term impacts of that will be, or what they are. Certainly, that's going to block photosynthesis in these understory plants. These understory plants are important food resources for wildlife. This also potentially has implications for forest regeneration and species turnover over time. So, we don't know the full story yet. It's still playing out because some of these processes are working more slowly. But also, I did want to mention the sooty mold, because this isn't just a problem in natural landscapes. Sooty mold will grow on anything. And so we need to mention it's hard to assign an economic value to it, but certainly spotted lanternfly is a nuisance pest for residents. And what you're looking at here is some decking that had honeydew and sooty mold growth. And so you can see the sooty mold was power washed off this first step and not the subsequent. And so the other thing you see in the yard, this is lanternfly on a tree of heaven in someone's yard. You can see on the ground that sooty mold is the black thing. And when lanternfly feed, they also cause trees to weep. So we have this frothy substance that is basically filled with fermenting bacteria and yeasts. It's smelly. It smells like vinegar. This is kind of a product of lanternfly honeydew deposition and the tree weeping. And it's its own little mystery that we're looking into a bit. But basically what is going on here is that these excretions, as well as the lanternfly excretions, attract stinging bees and wasps. And so it's smelly, people get stung, it makes it really hard to be outside. And so again, can't underestimate, how problematic this is in terms of being a nuisance pest for folks. And so what makes lanternfly so challenging is that even though it only goes through one generation per year, and if you've looked at your materials online, you might be somewhat familiar with the life cycle. It does only exhibit one generation per year, which is great. We have the early instars. They have smaller mouth parts, and so they tend to feed on more herbaceous plants. You see them then as fourth instars starting like in early July in our area in Pennsylvania. They begin to feed on woody tissues and so kind of move on to trees. And then as adults, they certainly feed on trees and a variety of things. And then we see those late season bouts of flight. And so we know they're moving throughout habitats, but part of the present story is we're really trying to characterize what that movement looks like, because they're constantly moving, and we're trying to work out the timing of that movement. And so Heather Leach, who formerly worked at Penn State, she did some fantastic work for us, especially looking at lanternfly impacts and behaviors in vineyards. And so this is looking at lanternfly in infested vineyards. They're there in lower numbers, and then they really spike in that September time region. And this particular study, it's kind of hard to get these data because they kind of require, in this case, you looking at the same trees in the same spot across, throughout a whole year, or in the case of this particular study, 2 years. And so this is a study I just want to mention to you where, we wanted to look at the effects of insecticides applied on red maple to see how effective they are in killing lanternfly. And so nobody really has an ornamental orchard, or experimental plot. And so here we took advantage of a residential area where all the trees were planted at the same time. So here you see these dots are red maples. And this study was led by Dennis Calvin, our former head of extension, and John Ross at Penn State Berks. And basically they tracked lanternfly on these trees, starting using sticky bands with early instars, and then removed those every week. And so basically what they did is, starting with the egg stage, they counted on the average for these 20 trees, how many lanternflies are there, how many egg masses, multiply by 37 eggs on average a mass, so you start with about 475 lanternfly on these trees. And you can see when you come in and put sticky bands up and trap them out, that reduces the number. So you see first instars, they drop down a bit. By second instars, again, you're coming in and you're trapping them out every week. Wow, this really looks cool. Like the trapping is working. Okay, what happened then is the adults, ruh-roh, the adults came back in. Okay, they're constantly moving. Does it mean that you didn't kill them? No, they killed them. They were on bands. They left those were removed from the population, but more came in. What did this do for egg masses? Okay, now if we say how many came in and how many egg masses were counted, we have to change the scale. That many more lanternfly eggs were laid. Okay, and so part of our experience is that because it is constantly moving, it's so hard to really know what if your treatments are efficacious or not. But also, it's really hard to know how far they travel. Certainly, any one study, we'll look at how far lanternfly will go in, one particular experimental bout. We marked them and followed these instars, or we goosed them and watched how much they fly. Those are important to know, but they really underestimate how far lanternflies go throughout their whole life cycle. And that's something that we're really trying to get a handle on. And this, I just want to mention, this is another study where we looked at lanternfly on red maple, and these were different sites. I'll blow this up a little bit more so you can see it. And each of these were different plots in different regions of Eastern Pennsylvania where trees were treated with insecticides. And so lanternfly coming into these red maple fed and then died underneath those trees. And so this is the pileup of dead bodies. And so basically that shows you they're moving into red maple, in September, but the times, it's that late season, but it really varies, but it's around September, October. Does this mean that they're not, that they're only moving on to red maple? No, this is what we tested. They will move on. We had thought at first maybe the ailanthus or tree of heaven was senescing, but they will go to new tree of heaven that hasn't been fed upon. And so it's just, they show this movement in the late season. And so you can see they're on tree of heaven their whole life cycle, same with grape, but a lot of our management techniques and suggestions out there kind of identify what are your important plants to look at. And so here we can see that, for different treatments, efficacy of ovicides is variable. Certainly if you have something like this, you want to try to treat it within a certain time frame. But the other thing that we've learned very recently is that most egg masses are laid where it's just too high to practically treat it. So does that mean you don't treat the egg masses you can reach? No, of course you can. But this shows that what we've learned is that you need a lot of tools in the toolbox. You have to keep hitting them at any life stage they're at. Also, the other thing that we've learned is that you're not going to stop them. You're not going to keep them off a property. Okay, the nymphs will come in. They feed on herbaceous plants, and so they feed for really short periods of time and then move on. So if you're concerned about your roses, you're concerned about your cucumbers, monitor those high value plants and potentially treat only them. Don't try to treat everything. And then to help with that timing, we've developed an egg hatch model that's available at our stopslf.org site. And so if, lanternfly, if you had a detection in Oregon and you're concerned, oh my, we thought we killed them all, but I'm worried if some got out and they laid their egg masses, then what you can do is, this is based on growing degree days observed to that point. You can look up and see how far along if you did have lanternfly, how far along would the hatch be? We're continuing to develop additional tools, not just at Penn State, but in our collective research and extension collaboration across multiple states. And then certainly You can see sudden increases in terms of nymphs, but certainly what we see are these spikes with adults coming into certain areas. And this is a study that Brian Walsh from Penn State will probably talk about when he presents in at the summit, where he's looked at what different tree species they're moving into. And they do seem to have a strong preference for maple at that late season. And so again, we have our calendar. Generally right now, chemical control methods are really what we have in hand, and we're trying to add additional tools to that toolkit that include biological and cultural controls. And so here, emerging as I'll, what about the lanternfly future? And I'll let you take a sip of coffee and enjoy some lanternfly egg hatching. So these are lanternfly emerging. What will emerge in the future? Well, what is emerging in front of you are little baby lanternflies. They're white when they emerge. This is a video taken by Pam Borowski at Lehigh Valley branch of Penn State. Happy birthday, little guys. Okay, what's going to happen next? That's tough to tell. And so I think the big questions about the future of lanternfly that I think about and am considering. The first is, are we seeing a collapse of lanternfly in the core? And so these are just the areas, the counties in the state of Pennsylvania that are under quarantine. The blue ones were just ones that were added last year. And so in 2018 versus 2020, we had the highest populations in these yellow areas still in the core. And then what we saw is it's a front now moving outward, where we see much lower numbers reported in the core, not throughout, they're not completely gone, but some areas that were consistently just nailed with lanternfly really have low numbers, even to the point where it's hard for us to find them for our studies, but there are these waves or moving fronts. And so does that mean that the lanternfly has collapsed? And so here it's tough when they're moving so much to document this, because they have that extremely patchy distribution. They're constantly moving and kind of bugging in and out of different areas. So this is really hard to document. But the other issue is, if the populations are collapsing, what's driving this? Okay, certainly control efforts are helping, right? But in terms of a true crash, like was seen with brown marmorated stink bug, how would that happen? And so what we know with brown marmorated stink bug, where you had really high numbers and then what looked to be a population crash, is that was associated with parasitoid wasps, our natural enemies, coming in and attacking stink bug. And so we don't think that we have a similar kind of mechanism going on with lanternfly. What we know with stink bug is that there's a suite of native stink bugs, 5 or 6 species that naturally occur in Pennsylvania and in eastern US, and they've co-evolved with their own natural enemies, with wasps that lay their eggs in their eggs and whatnot. And so because we already have those species present that are natural enemies of stink bugs, when this new stink bug came in from Asia, it ultimately shifted its host onto this additional stink bug species. We don't have anything comparable with lanternfly. There aren't any other plant hoppers that are closely related, with these strong natural enemies. So as far as a collapse, it doesn't seem to be a natural enemy. Most likely with seeing how their seasonal patterns vary, it looks like, if anything, it's most likely to be that they're tapping out their food resources. They're depleting those trees. And if they're depleting those trees, it's likely that's temporary, and they may very well move back in. And so my conclusion at present is that with as much as you see this distributed and continued expansion, especially in the areas of higher human population densities, I don't think we're seeing an end in sight. We might be seeing some relief. I hope it's not temporary for some regions, but we are seeing some relief, but not the time to let our guard down. Where is it going to establish? I have just a couple more slides. I'll wrap up here. And here there's different predictive models. And so the question is it going to move south? And if it does, when it has longer periods where other plants are growing, where its food source is more reliable and trees senesce later, are they going to reproduce more? maybe not multiple generations, but multiple egg masses, because we know in captivity they can lay more than one egg mass. And based on, because their food preference is relative, what are they going to shift onto if, because that basically what else is being planted there in abundance that they might like that we just don't have where lanternfly currently exists. And so this particular model predicts areas, just to look at this little code here, areas in red show high suitability for lanternfly to establish there. Areas in blue are low suitability. Basically, this shows it moving into southern, more tropical or hotter regions, and less so really in California, Oregon, and Washington. But a different model, a different approach. Again, we can talk about this more in the context of the research as to why these vary. But another model is looking a little bit more suggestive that lanternfly, yeah, they can establish really well in regions where like California, Oregon, Washington, more temperate regions, less so in the South. And so that's one of the things we're working on to try to figure out maybe biological limits where lanternfly might and might not be able to establish. And so at present, we're working on these degree day requirements for reproductive development to get a sense of maybe these southern regions of their distribution. And so, we're looking if there are longer degree days, if you can develop faster and live longer, are you going to mate longer? Are you going to lay eggs longer? What's interesting is that very preliminary evidence where we're seeing it looks like another Q may be at play, that it's not just a degree day issue. And I'll get to that. And what else might it feed upon? Well, we'll get to that too. And so, so there's certainly a lot of the story that's left unknown. And I'll leave you with this as my last slide. I hope I've shared some good news with you, but there are multiple studies I have to point out, and Matt Helmus will probably talk about this because he is, he does predictions of how lanternfly is going to move. More than one study kind of agrees that there is a greater spread associated with, if lanternfly is in areas that are that have high human populations, then that makes it more likely to spread. Oh, and so basically what this picture is, this is a picture my husband took. I went to Hershey Park for the first time, and I have such a mixed emotion of feelings here. I love roller coasters. I love lanternflies. And this is a lanternfly that matches this great coaster. But it's also horrifying, right? As lanternfly gets in regions where, it could potentially really spread. And so we need to be on our guard. I'm concerned, and I'll wrap up here, but I have to say that with 480 folks attending today and you all being here to learn about lanternfly, I think that bodes well for our future and the extent to which we can really try to limit the spread of this pest. So I'd like to thank folks in my lab, thanks my funding agencies, and direct you to the extension website for information from Penn State, as well as our grant site. And so with that, I will stop sharing my screen and take a breath.
Thank you, Julie. That was wonderful. I have to laugh. You are a true entomologist, right? If I caught that correctly, you left North Carolina to go to Pennsylvania to be in the middle of spotted lanternfly, right?
Pretty much, yep.
So don't tell me you're moving to Illinois anytime soon, please. No, thank you so much. There were we got a couple of minutes, so there were a couple of questions in the Q&A that I think were answered toward the end. The one from Mary about being tropical. I think you initially said that spotted lanternfly is from a typically tropical family, but this one isn't necessarily. So that model that you were showing at the end kind of indicates that the family would move toward more tropical and warmer areas, but this one isn't necessarily adapting from the tropics to our climates here. Okay.
Yes, thanks for bringing that. Yeah, so basically it's unusual among lanternflies in that it does occur even if it's in its native range at cooler temperatures in more temperate environments. It's also very unique in that it is the only plant hopper any of us know about. And by us, I mean the legends of the field who are in their 90s or at the Paris Museum. all plant hopper species have 5 instars, not 4. So this one is kind of a freak. It has a longer life, a longer adult stage. And so this is unusual in a lot of respects, even from other things.
It seems
But
like a lot of the, oh, go ahead, I'm sorry.
But those particular models, though, were about this species.
Okay.
It was using using variables associated with the habitat, like the climatic conditions in the area where it occurs, to then predict where else those other habitats are similar. That's what those models are using.
I was going to say, it seems like a lot of these invasives seem to have some kind of ace in the hole or trick up their sleeve these days, whether it's jumping worms or spotted lanternfly or brown marmorated stink bug. So there is one more set of questions. There were about 3 of them that were all related.
Yeah.
Surrounding Pierce's disease and transmission or vectoring of pathogens. Is there any evidence or studies being done on that?
There are studies being done on that. And so Christina Rosa is a plant pathologist who's going to present on that on day 1 of the summit. And so she has a student who is starting the 2nd year of studies, looking at whether or not it can transmit Pierce's disease, a phytoplasma, and a virus. So 3 different things. She'll share the preliminary data. It's not a clear picture, so it's not a strong yes, and it's not an absolute no, but she'll give the latest, greatest, because I haven't seen the data they've crunched yet.
Perfect. Well, thank you again so much. We look forward to all of your presentations during the summit. And if you can stick around and take a look through the Q&A, if there's any other questions in there you feel good answering, feel free, but we'll shift gears now. So thank you so much once again.
I will do that. Thank you so much. Bye.
Thanks.